Traditional historical education teaches that Africans first arrived in the Americas solely as enslaved individuals during the transatlantic slave trade. However, this narrative represents only a partial truth. An expanding collection of evidence indicates that people of African descent were present in the Americas millennia before Christopher Columbus reached the New World. The concept that ancient African seafarers, merchants, and colonists arrived in the Americas well before European explorers disrupts long-established historical frameworks, prompting fresh inquiries about the cultural interactions that influenced early American civilizations. The existence of people of African origin in pre-Columbian America extends beyond mere conjecture. It finds validation through diverse forms of historical, archaeological, linguistic, and genetic proof. Ancient African sailors are thought to have journeyed across the Atlantic Ocean, creating connections with indigenous American communities. These early expeditions were not singular occurrences, but components of a wider pattern of African exploration and commerce. This article examines the persuasive evidence indicating early African presence in the Americas, the impact of African cultural and technological innovations on indigenous civilizations, and the deliberate erasure of this history by colonial authorities. Through analyzing these historical links, we develop a richer comprehension of the intricacy and variety of human movement and contact long before European domination transformed the world. Among the most substantial pieces of evidence validating the presence of people of African descent in the Americas before Columbus is the maritime prowess of ancient African civilizations. Well before European oceanic exploration, African societies had cultivated sophisticated shipbuilding methods and navigational expertise that permitted them to execute long-distance journeys across the ocean. The ancient Egyptians, Carthaginians, and Malians are among the African civilizations considered to have possessed the capability for transatlantic travel. The naval accomplishments of ancient Egyptians are thoroughly documented. Egyptian reliefs and murals illustrate large seafaring vessels suitable for extended voyages. Inscriptions from the era of Pharaoh Necho around 600 BCE describe an African circumnavigation of the continent, indicating that Egyptian and Nubian sailors were already investigating distant territories. Some researchers propose that Egyptian explorers may have arrived in the Americas, transporting their knowledge and culture with them. Beyond the Egyptians, the Carthaginians, successors of the Phoenicians, were recognized for their remarkable navigational abilities. They created widespread trade networks across the Mediterranean and further, and there is evidence implying that they may have traveled as far as the Americas. Carthaginian coins and artifacts have been discovered in areas of South America, further validating the likelihood of pre-Columbian African interaction. Perhaps the most thoroughly documented instance of an African expedition to the Americas originates from the Mali Empire. In the 14th century, Mali's monarch Mansa Abubakari II is reported to have initiated an ambitious journey across the Atlantic with a fleet of 2,000 vessels. While conventional history rejects this voyage as mythology, historical documentation from Arab scholars such as al-Umari chronicle Abu Bakr's departure and his abdication of the throne in search of new territories. The remarkable parallels between West African and Mesoamerican cultural components suggest that his expedition may have arrived in the Americas and produced a lasting influence on indigenous societies. Archaeological findings across the Americas offer persuasive evidence of early African interaction. One of the most remarkable discoveries is the existence of large carved stone heads in the ancient Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica. The Olmec civilization, which prospered in present-day Mexico around 1200 BCE, left behind enormous stone sculptures portraying individuals with characteristically African features, including wide noses, full lips, and tightly coiled hair. These sculptures have prompted many scholars to conclude that the Olmec had interactions with African visitors or settlers. Beyond the Olmec heads, other artifacts indicate early African influence in the Americas. African-style cotton gourds and linguistic parallels between certain African and indigenous American languages further validate this theory. The existence of African DNA markers in some indigenous American populations also indicates intermingling between African and native peoples long before European interaction. Additionally, similarities between African and American agricultural methods, such as the construction of earth mounds, suggest possible transatlantic exchanges. Both West African and Mesoamerican civilizations constructed large ceremonial mounds for religious and social functions, a shared tradition that implies a connection between the two cultures. This connection disputes the conventional narrative that such developments emerged in isolation. Despite the compelling evidence of African presence in the Americas before Columbus, this history has been deliberately suppressed. European colonial authorities attempted to dominate historical narratives to validate their conquests and establish racial hierarchies that positioned Africans and indigenous peoples at the lowest level. Acknowledging that Africans had been global explorers and contributors to ancient civilizations would have contradicted the Eurocentric worldview that depicted Africans as primitive and incapable of sophisticated achievements. Throughout the colonial period, European historians rejected or actively suppressed documentation of African voyages to the Americas. Early European explorers, including Columbus himself, recorded encounters with dark-skinned indigenous peoples in the Caribbean and South America. Yet these accounts were largely disregarded or reinterpreted to align with colonial narratives. Spanish chroniclers, such as Bartolomé de las Casas, noted that some native peoples described encounters with African traders, but these records were not afforded serious consideration by mainstream historians. Furthermore, the transatlantic slave trade performed a significant function in eliminating African contributions to American history. The forced displacement of millions of Africans to the Americas generated a narrative that characterized Africans exclusively as enslaved laborers rather than as explorers, traders, or contributors to early American civilizations. This narrative persists in shaping mainstream historical perspectives today. The history of people of African descent in America, long before Columbus, is a narrative of exploration, cultural exchange, and resilience. From the sophisticated seafaring capabilities of ancient African civilizations to the archaeological and linguistic evidence of African influence in the Americas, the argument for pre-Columbian African contact is substantial. However, the systematic suppression of this history has resulted in widespread ignorance of these early connections. By reclaiming and acknowledging this hidden history, we obtain a more precise understanding of the complexity of human migration and cultural interaction. The story of people of African descent in the Americas before Columbus is not merely an alternative historical perspective. It is an essential component of the global human story, one that merits recognition and further exploration.